than just internet history, but we asked him to emphasize this aspect of it today, and take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you everyone for coming on a Saturday on this beautiful weather in the middle of a Thanksgiving break as well. We're going to reorganize slightly because of the time. We have about an hour left. I was planning on making some introductory comments to you, and then I'd like to actually move on to the workshop part of it, which is looking at how we teach internet history and an internet curriculum, and I'll tell you a little bit about the curriculum that we've developed. So, as Jolie pointed out on the website, it's 40 years ago in the Bay Area that data flowed seamlessly from a van to SRI in Menlo Park and the University of Southern California in Los Angeles via England, Boston and Sweden across 3 types of networks: packet radio, satellite network and the ARPANET. And all this as a van cruised around the Bay Area roads. According to the Computer History Museum, this was the birth of the internet. So a wonderful week to celebrate. Around then in 1977, I was an undergraduate, and I certainly wasn't even remotely aware of this historic event. And even if someone had told me, I wouldn't have had any idea what TCP was or grasped the importance of this amazing conception. I was an early adopter of computers. I had an Apple II at school, and I was using a Amstrad, if anyone remembers those, to type on. And I started my career as a foreign correspondent around this time, and I was writing stories on a Tandy laptop and trying to file them using an acoustic coupler from telephone boxes around the world. Though looking back on it, I seem to remember that I was dictating my stories via the telephone more often than I managed to get an internet connection through the acoustic coupler. But I did learn a lot about communications, and later when I came to the United States in 2001, after a long career as a foreign correspondent, I was asked to begin to teach media studies and journalism at the school my boys were attending in Princeton. It was at that stage that I realized that the medium is the message, as McLuhan has taught us, and the medium for students today is not the newspapers or the radio or the television that I grew up with. Most of my students then had never even seen a physical newspaper. Yet they were operating in a digital world, and it struck me immediately that they know nothing about this digital world. And it was quite an epiphany for me at that stage. And as a teacher, of course, I immediately went online to try and find some material, curriculum, to teach my students about the digital world. And lo and behold, there was no material. This led to me beginning to develop this material that has now turned into living online, and I'll tell you about the curriculum later. An educationalist called Mark Prensky popularized the term digital native, something that he came to regret later on because it became hijacked and used in a sense to cover up the fact that a whole generation of youth born in the digital era were described as digital natives, and people assumed, well, because they're born in a digital era, they understand everything about digital technology. Now, this is a fallacy that has damaged a lot of things in education. Lots of teachers and adults thought, we don't need to teach them. What can we teach them about technology? They're the ones who are teaching us how to use things, much as I probably taught my parents how to program the VCR. But things are a great deal more complicated than programming a VCR. And in a sense, using the term digital native versus the older generation described as digital immigrants who would never be fluent in the digital language set us back many decades. Another thing that set us back was the adoption of technology in schools. And this can sound ironic, but schools in many places felt that by introducing laptops and smart boards, what I call the bling of technology, they were impressing parents, they were impressing other schools, that they were at the cutting edge of technology in education. In fact, in terms of hardware, they might have been, but there was little, if no, curricular change. So the curriculum today looks very much in most schools as it did 10 or 20 years ago. There are new subjects, yes, but the bulk of the subjects that are taught still revolve around the classic code and the canon of education. We're talking here, we've spoken, as Dave Faber did, about computer science, which is still mainly focused on coding, but lacks the element of teaching a broader curriculum about the internet and the digital world. So for younger people, for my students, and I teach high school, but I've also taught middle school students, the world that they live in is out of sync in many ways with the curriculum that they're meeting in schools. There's a disjoint between their experience of the world, which is now so much online based, and the curriculum that they're being taught in schools. And I've spoken a number of conferences, and I meet my colleagues from around the world and talk to them as well. And what we've seen is that along with the hardware came a sense of responsibility on behalf of schools, on behalf of parents, to teach children to be safe online, the emphasis on online safety. One can't argue with that. Anyone who goes online today, just the recent debacle about YouTube Kids and the videos available on YouTube, the whole fake news, focus on fake news, has taught us that there is a lot that we need to teach our kids, youth, about being safe online, not just for their immediate safety, but there's very much an eye in schools on their future. What will they post online now that might come back to haunt them when they apply for colleges, for example, is something that schools focus a lot on. Cyberbullying, sexting, privacy issues, and so forth. So these are very, very worthy and important subjects to teach in schools, but it also means that schools quite often feel, well, they've done their bit. They've done their bit in making sure that their students are safe online, and that's sort of where their responsibility regarding digital education begins and ends. I argue that that is part of it, just as coding is also part of what we need to teach kids, though how much is debatable. I argue that there's a whole slew of elements that we're not teaching our kids. Everything from understanding the basics of how the internet works. As we also touched upon earlier, the history of the internet, I believe, is essential to teach the next generation. Where does all this come from? How can we even begin to understand where it's going if we don't know where it came from? Important things like what drives the internet, the whole data-driven, advertising-driven part of the internet. Important issues such as identity, privacy, big data, the psychology of the internet, what happens to human beings when we go online, how does that change the way that we interact, the way that we behave ourselves. So there are many, many topics. I think when I started to develop my curriculum, I listed up to 60 different lesson plans, which was far too ambitious. I've scaled it back to somewhere between 25 and 30, and I still think that's a lot. There are two major hurdles that facing trying to talk to schools and teachers about teaching a broader digital or internet literacy, as I'd like to call it, program, which is, as ever, the time constraint in curriculum. Teachers are teaching too much and have too little time to begin to introduce new topics. Secondly, teachers lack the knowledge themselves. Even computer science teachers would find it very hard to teach a course on cyber psychology, for example. So there's that is another barrier. Material, lack of available material and lesson plans, which hopefully we're close to having solved now with a full curriculum covering, as I said, close to 30 different topics. Textbooks, I'm writing one now, which will be out next fall on how to teach these internet studies. And also the one thing that isn't lacking, though, is interest on behalf of students. Students, I've found, teaching these topics now for the past 3 years, are absolutely passionate about talking and involving and especially debating all the issues that they're confronting online. So at the moment, people are telling them, parents, teachers especially, are teaching them what not to do online, but actually teaching them how to take advantage of the internet and be creative online is taught in some respects, as in building websites, making videos and so forth. But actually, without the deeper understanding, I argue, of how the internet works, students will not become engaged, critical users of the internet. They'll become more passive consumers. And I certainly, for one, would like to see students being able to not only consume, but also produce, and also very much be involved in development of the internet, the future path of the internet. I do tell students that the internet is only at its infancy now, and that they can be part of shaping how it's going to develop. Right now, with the net neutrality, people can sign petitions, which they've done in hundreds of thousands, if not millions, showing that they are feel passionate about the way that the internet is developing and who's going to run it and how it's going to look. But without understanding of how the internet works, it's very difficult to explain what net neutrality is on a deeper level. So these subjects do need to be taught. Students are not going to pick them up themselves as they pick up internet gaming skills or app skills. These are subjects that are more complex, and one of the challenges that I want to talk to you about today is how do we turn these sometimes very complex and even, dare I say, boring, unless you're very nerdy, subjects to become attractive to a 13-year-old student who has never confronted these topics before. So when you look at the newer AP topics in computer science, you'll see there's a broader focus today talking about algorithms, not just from a technical point of view, but the role of algorithms, a bit more internet knowledge of the internet, topics like privacy and interaction between humans and technology. I teach from a non-tech point of view. I am not a computer science graduate. I studied politics, international relations, and then spent decades as a journalist. I came to this from a different angle, which is what has also shaped the curriculum that I've developed. So there's very little technical knowledge other than I'd say the first two lesson plans, which cover the history of the internet and an introduction to how the internet works. Other than that, all the subjects that I teach can be taught beyond computer science. They can be taught in a math class, for example, about algorithms, social sciences, history classes, even English classes. I have lesson plans on digital writing and digital reading. How does the internet and the digital world affect the way that we communicate and write? So there are many aspects of the internet that don't necessarily need to be pigeonholed in a computer science class and can be fitted in elsewhere. What I wanted to do with you today, given our limited time, was to focus on the history of the internet. We've heard a fascinating account from Dave Farber today about the birth of the internet and the early development of the internet. What I want to challenge you today to do is for us to brainstorm together, and you'll find some sheets in the folders that I've distributed. What exactly would you focus on in terms of a lesson plan that, say, spans 50 minutes and could be either for a middle school class or a high school class? Now, given the huge range of topics you can choose from, what do you focus on? What would your goal be with a group of young kids, and leaving them with a message after 50 minutes talking about the history of the internet? So what would your goals be? How would you go about achieving them in a lesson plan that would also try somehow to engage the students actively, so they're not just sitting listening to a lecture about the history of the internet, which is fascinating in itself, but they can also be involved somehow in the class and in understanding the topic? How far back do we go? Do we go back to Ada Lovelace and Charles Babbage? And I have a wonderful book I want to share with you, which is a cartoon about Ada Lovelace and Babbage. Absolutely fascinating stuff as a teaching material. Bletchley Park, Sputnik we heard about today. Where do you start? What is the element. Can you teach, for example, using Bletchley Park and talking about early computers or Sputnik to students who don't know anything about the Cold War? So you have to assume different levels of knowledge where they come in, and always remember that our knowledge is not their knowledge. What do we impart? So this is the challenge. If we have time, I'd also very much like to talk to you about, on a broader perspective, what do you think is important to teach the next generation or the current generation of youth about the internet? What should they know to be digital citizens of the world today? What is important to include in their knowledge? So that's my challenge to you. We have about 3/4 of an hour until lunch. I'd like to suggest that we try and group around 1 or 2 tables at the front rather. So I'd like you to come forward and let's brainstorm and see what we can come up with. I'd also like you to remember that this video that we're shooting today will be distributed to members of the Internet Society and to computer science teachers globally. So let's try and have a global perspective for our students in many different continents and with different platforms that they'll be using.
So we're not going to video this conversation, but then we're going to ask you to make presentations of your conclusions when you finish, okay?
Yeah. So given how many are we? 3, 6. Can we maybe form 2 or 3 groups?
Yeah, we'll form one here.
All right, thank you, groups. Okay, we have less than excuse me, your attention, please. We have about 10 to 15 minutes before we break for lunch. I set you a challenge, which was to develop a lesson plan or the outlines of a lesson plan, with the goal being to teach either a middle school or a high school classroom the basics of the history of the internet. So my challenge to you was to outline, what would your goal be? What would you want a student attending this class to walk out of the classroom with in terms of knowledge which you deem to be necessary to understand the history of the internet, but also as a foundation for understanding how the internet works, which would be the follow-up lesson, which would be to actually understand the nuts and bolts of how the internet works. So given that a middle school student or a high school student pretty much anywhere in the world would have next to zero knowledge about the topics that we heard about earlier from Dave Farber, the birth of the internet, or let alone the technology, what of all these amazing facts, which sometimes I heard the word romanticize here when we look back on the birth of the internet, and sometimes if we have more of a technological background, we might be fascinated by TCP/IP protocols and packet switching, but is that really necessary for a student to understand in order to understand how the internet works when we're moving forward? So what of all these facts would you focus on, and how would you convey that in a 45 to 50 minute lesson? That was my challenge to you. And I'm now going to hand over to the spokesperson for each of the 2 groups to briefly present, and then I hope we can continue the discussion about trying to coalesce around some agreed facts that we think are necessary for the young person, the young student, today's world to know about the history of the internet. So we'll start with you.
Thanks. I'm Greg, and representing the group with Michael, Eric, and Sanket. What we wanted the group to come away with overall is this sense of how innovation drove development of the internet. We start out with kind of fact zero, if you will, the human desire to collaborate and communicate, which is what drives this. Then we would set the stage very briefly, talk about the prehistory of communication. Just mention that there have been previous, starting with writing and printing and radio and television, bursts of innovation. And one potential assignment students could have after the class is to look at one of these prior bursts of innovation and compare it to the innovation of the internet and what drove it. And that next, that at each point in these periodic bursts, there were a few people who recognized a problem that the general population didn't see. The general population was happy enough with where they were at, and mentioned that in 1903, the head of the U.S. Patent Office suggested closing it because all the worthwhile inventions had already been made. So the general population does not recognize sometimes that there's a need for innovation. But if yes, yes, right, the head of the U.S. Patent Office is hardly the general population. So the few people recognized the problem and tried to solve it. And then we get to the particular of who were these people at this very beginning. What problem were they trying to solve? First, they were high school students in, Southern California, and college students who just were trying to connect. They were building computers, and they were saying, well, let's connect the computers. Let's connect our two computers in different rooms. How do we do this? And then they know people at the next school. How do we connect that? So it starts out with very small problems being solved. And that at no point did anybody recognize just where this was going. And then, so that is kind of the birth of the network. And then other people are doing this, or other people are sent off, as Dave said, because you didn't want to communicate with many people competing for attention in a foreign country, they were told to organize themselves. So they created networks. And then what you have to do is link the networks together, and what you get is the internet, which is a network of networks.
So less focus on DARPA, less focus on Cold War necessity.
Bring in the fact that this was in a sense, a private-public partnership before that term became known. You had a combination of science and military and academia and just natural curiosity all coming together. Try to weave in the facts, but this is kind of the skeleton, and then the question is where do you to find the facts to hang on this, because I think it's a shape that you want to put on.
No, keep on going. Just to add to what you just said, our flow is less about going to a specific point in origin. We're trying to relate the internet to other previous big shifts in communications, and that the internet itself was a series of many different groups working together and parallel threads coming together. Whereas today we're often taught the history is, it goes back to the ARPA and DARPA days and, Barron and those people. And that's less important because many other things, you can't teach that many other things were happening back then. And then, then you get into all these things about there was this AT&T and Bell monopoly, and many of these ideas existed already inside this Bell Labs, as David said, but because it was a monopoly and these revolutionary new ideas were going to cut into AT&T's revenues, they were sort of pushed down and squandered. We could have had the internet
the fax machine.
We could have had the transistor before World War II because the patents were applied in, the 20s, and they could have been, instead of putting resources into certain areas, they could have been pushing a lot more on transistor technology and had it in the late 30s, early 40s as opposed to the 50s. So there are many things along those lines. We don't want to go back to a point in origin.
Okay. And
one could tie it to larger social things in the 60s when a lot of this really started up. We had a openness and let it all hang out philosophy that was building around the world, the summer of love and all of that. And I think there's some of that too, which I think
idealism?
Part of what you want to point out is there's an idealism that where the internet was founded. And it was not founded by a single company trying to derive maximum profits. It was really, or by a government agency, but rather there was this broad, permissionless group that was coming together that was creating a method for communication and then communicating about improving it, using that very method to communicate about it, which in a sense is unique. So the last parts move, now that we have the network of networks, what is this about? It's about communication. It's about moving content. Given the lack of bandwidth, the initial content was data. The first computer game was all text. If anybody's played, Adventure or Dungeon. So then the next concept is bandwidth drives content. Content drives bandwidth. So there's developments of innovation around how can you make the internet bigger and fatter and what kind of content are you trying to put on it. So people develop content now for the internet. When this began, there was no content that existed because the internet existed or to be put over the internet. Now it's almost taking over. Every other kind of content is kind of coalescing onto the internet. And kind of the last element of disruptive change is the smartphone, mobile net applications, and
7x24, two-way
yeah, right. So you have the interactivity at each point. You have this kind of permissionless innovation, and at the same time, you have people trying to coalesce. If you want to get into the kind of commerce versus idealism duality, you can kind of introduce it at different points, or maybe you save that for later. You may hint at it now because this is a table setting session.
Indeed.
And then later on, you get to, okay, let's go back to this overall session. You know,
What drives
what's the how,
Yeah.
and then you get into the kind of the more nuts and bolts of kind of the practical history of the
What
internet.
drives it.
And then you
Great.
get into kind of the philosophical history of the internet, and then you may get into the social history of the internet, each in kind of a different one. So they're all, I think, teed up in this structure.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you for sharing. Over to you. And that's
So we started by really focusing on middle school. Thought that that would be more of a challenge, that these are kids who have grown up with technology, have something in front of their face like at all times, but they don't really understand how it works. They don't understand anything that's like kind of beyond the screen, anything that's invisible, and especially the decisions that were made to get to the technology that we have today. So we also started by talking about the things that we would have been interested in if we were that age. And what was interesting is that all of us were kind of interested in different things. So the history, right? Or like slide rulers and abacuses. And so and like understanding that. Or a lot of us like games, and some of us are interested in breaking things and then like fixing them and seeing how they work. So, you know, that's a very common thing also with kids when you're teaching them something, especially a large class, is that they all have different entry points into a subject. So one of the best things that you can do in building curriculum is give them open-ended problems to solve, and then also multiple points of entry, sort of like different on-ramps onto the information superhighway. Understanding the information superhighway. I'm glad you liked that. No, that was good. It was very cheesy. I'm glad it landed. Thank you. So what we had sort of written down, and we really liked the idea of the timelines, but having the understanding that we all have different interests in the timelines, having different timelines, and seeing maybe a possible overlap between these timelines, but timelines, multiple timelines, political choices and decisions that were made and how that affected the internet, technological innovations that were made and how that affected corporate, hackers, gaming, and communication channels. And so the mechanics of which this would be used in a class, I'm not exactly too sure, but that being able to lay this out for students to be able to use with their teachers, or teachers to be able to use with their students as a jump-off point for discussions and conversations like we had. So some of the questions that we came up with that we were like really interested in. What do you consider major tech advancements? And that could be on different timelines. What are examples of popular communication channels, both current and historical, and the overlap between them? So, you know, if one of the things that you'd mentioned, which I thought was really interesting, is that there's been a move from like group communication maybe to more singular communication, or point-to-point communication between individuals. And then you could even compare that to older ones versus ones today, and what are similar or not. Like phone lines or group phone lines, isn't that what it was? What was it called? Party lines. Thank you so much. Like group chats.
before CB radio.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Mm.
And then
Lands of the UK, that's what they had where Jolly grew up.
there you go. But so, you know, we were also talking about, you know, analog versus digital, right? Comparisons, and that might be a good way to sort of explain some of those too. How do you think the internet is used, like in as far as the channels or infrastructure that's behind it, and then coming up with ways? And I wrote down an example. Ingrid Burrington, who told me about this thing today but isn't here, developed this great program actually for kids where they would model it with like foam blocks and then put pictures on it. It's called network land. But it's a way, like with a physical representation, to get kids to actually make networks. Like, how do you think that you get the dancing hot dog GIF on your phone when you want? Like, where does that come from? It has to come from somewhere. So to actually have them build with toys, just blocks and strings, how the internet works. And that's a good way to start talking about it and introducing the vocabulary. And then what are previous examples of bad information? And bad information could also be on these multiple timelines. We were dealing a lot, like you're talking about, with understanding fake news, but I think you had some more examples and I didn't write them down, but outside of fake news, there were other like pieces of bad information.
Yeah, because in the world it's some part good news and bad news in all internet. It prevent children from this bad news.
We talked a lot about hacking, but I think that there's also historical examples of hacking or different ways that we could talk about it today that make it more understandable and relatable to them. But I think that the overall, it's a lot of information to be able to relay to kids in 45 or 50 minutes. So I think as much as you can detextualize it and just give them the vocabulary so that they can carry that forward through multiple modules would be really important. And I don't think that you're going to be able to get everything across to them like in 50 minutes, but at least if you can just give them like the seeds, and then maybe even give them like names exactly.
Technology.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think one point that I'd like to focus on is your idea of a timeline, which I think is excellent. It also gives a perspective just at the pace of development, but also to illustrate that we are really only at the birth of the internet still. 40 years is nothing in terms of the development, in terms of where we might be going, and to show that this is ongoing. We haven't finished the development. We're still building the internet. And
Baby stages.
in the stages, in terms of the different development stages, from academic, military, commercial, where we're going with it now. Because generally when younger people especially are asked, what is the internet? And I always get them to do a drawing of the internet as one of the first exercises in classes. I give them a blank piece of paper and I say, draw how you imagine, how you envisage the internet. And invariably we get a cloud, and that's pretty much the internet. And in that cloud, you have all the other things. And then you ask, well, who owns the internet, or what is the internet? Oh, well, Facebook runs the internet. And that's generally, I think Mozilla also found that from asking different groups across the world, especially in developing or in emerging markets. Facebook is seen as being unanimous.
Like places like Myanmar, where the only way that you can get to the internet is actually through Facebook.
Right. So teaching them the history and the origin shows, A, that it's not Facebook, and B, that the development was not inevitable, that it would take the course that it did take. Yes.
But missing from both of our
histories just now, and I agree with a lot of what you said. We had thought about some of these things as well. Missing from both of ours was any notion of a business model or some type of commercial development, because for children to immediately say Facebook owns the internet, it begs the question, well, how did we get to this point? So we have to build into our curriculum this notion of economic forces and who pays for it all.
We do. I think that's also very important. I think to ask, for example, if you ask a student how come that they can search Google for free, that they can send emails for free, that there is no free, and the proverbial thing we say that if you're not paying, then you are the product. But to understand what it is that drives the internet commercially, then you understand data, you understand advertising, you understand the psychology of getting people online and keeping them online. So all these mechanisms of what drives the internet, they need to understand, because they are part of it. They're generating the data, it's their data, or they're paying via premium or freemium services through Spotify and Amazon and YouTube. But until you understand the economics of the internet, you don't understand what drives these models.
Some of that they don't need to have to pay. You also need to tell them that. There are some things you pay, some things you don't.
What is free other than Wikipedia?
Open source.
Open source.
Yeah, and the free software movement. Yeah, not everything you need to pay. You have to also tell them that.
Right.
And you can actually make them and let people use it.
Yes, yeah.
The other thing we were talking about touring,
We're not talking about Turing and how, created a new avenue of that the internet was really developed to solve problems, a quicker way of solving problems. So we also have to touch on that it wasn't about entertaining, more like solving problems, a quicker way of getting stuff done and more efficiently without the human error. So we can also touch on that also.
Yeah. I think that's a very good point indeed. Yeah.
I would like to give, because as a teacher, I would like to give them some assignment to research on.
Mm-hmm.
And since we are talking about CS, we already spoke today, like how coding is very, like we are separating coding from real humanities. So I would like to give them some project, like go and figure out what's the cost of internet right now, what are providers in their labor.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to continue that discussion when we move into lunch to talk about other elements of what you would consider necessary for an internet user today who comes with no knowledge to acquire. And one of the things is definitely things like ethical elements of coding, that coding is not divorced from society, that coding is not unbiased, just as algorithms are not biased, and to understand how these are used and shaped by us as users of the internet and creators of code and algorithms and so forth. So yes, let's definitely continue the discussion over lunch of what goes into being internet literate today. Just as we have definitions of reading and writing, and what constitutes literacy. What does an internet literate person need to learn today in society? So thank you very much for your contributions here.
So the one thing that, as the Internet Society, which is a thing that we emphasize, is the development of the multi-stakeholder model. And this is a rather unique development that is a result of the Internet, of the way that the Internet Engineering Task Force grew up. And there is this thing with no kings, no, running code as the principle of the Internet Engineering Task Force. And we talked about net neutrality, and this is something, people wonder why the Internet Society is not gung-ho for regulation, but the Internet was essentially an end-run round regulation that happened, by this method. And I think the one thing which I think is good to show your kids is like John Perry Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, and to discuss whether that still stands and whether it's still true or not, and the fact that there is the way that the internet is managed worldwide is unprecedented in history, that everything before has been managed by nations at a top level, and that the internet is outside in and bottom up. So these principles, the principles of multi-stakeholderism, bottom up, are important things, qualities of the internet to imply. I'd like to thank Reuben. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'd also like to say, if you're not a member of the Internet Society, you should be, and that we have more food here than we can possibly eat. I brought more baggies so that you can, there's three sandwiches for everyone, so that you can eat one and you can take two more. And there's also salad, and that's it.
Pay it forward. Thank you, John.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Yay.